I never expected to find myself typing these words. My name is Zakariah, though my coworkers call me Zach, and everything I'm about to tell you started with insomnia and a broken air conditioner last summer. It was 3 in the morning, August heat making my apartment feel like an oven, when I found myself scrolling through videos I'd never normally watch. Your channel appeared in my feed somehow, a testimony from a woman who said she met Jesus in a marketplace. I remember thinking it was ridiculous. I remember pressing play anyway. The woman's voice had something in it, something raw and unpolished that cut through the digital noise. She wasn't performing, wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. She just spoke, quietly, about a moment that changed everything. When the video ended, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My laptop screen dimmed to black, reflecting my face back at me in the darkness. And for reasons I still can't explain, I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me watch her. I was 31 then, unmarried, but promised to Layla since we were children. Our family's already planning a wedding for the following spring. I worked as an engineer for a construction company, designing bridges that would carry thousands of people safely across rivers and valleys. Precision was my language, calculations my prayer. Every Friday I stood shoulder to shoulder with my father and brothers in the mosque, our voices joining the familiar chorus that had anchored my life since boyhood. My routine was sacred in its simplicity. Dawn prayer before the city woke, afternoon prayer in the quiet bathroom stall at work, where I'd spread my small rug on the cold tile floor, evening prayer as the sun painted our building golden. Between these moments, I built things that would last. I solved problems with logic and formulas. I was useful, productive, faithful. I told myself this was enough. But that night, sweating in my broken air conditioning, something cracked open inside me. The woman in the video had described a hunger she couldn't name, a restlessness that followed her even into prayer. I knew that hunger. I'd been carrying it for months, maybe years, like a stone in my chest that grew heavier each day. During prayers, my mind would wander to strange places. I'd find myself staring at the minaret against the sky, wondering if God ever looked back. I'd catch myself listening not to the imam's words, but to the silence between them, as if something else was trying to speak. The worst part was how guilty this made me feel. I had everything a faithful man should want: respect, family, purpose, a future mapped out in traditions older than my grandfather's grandfather. Yet lying in bed after midnight prayers, I'd feel this terrible emptiness spreading through my ribs like cold water. I started reading extra chapters of Quran, thinking more devotion would fill whatever was missing. Instead, the emptiness grew stronger, more insistent, like something alive stirring in the darkness of my chest. That woman's testimony haunted me for days. Her words echoed in unexpected moments, during client meetings, while reviewing blueprints, in the pause between the call to prayer and the first response. She'd mentioned dreams, vivid ones where someone called her name with a voice she'd never heard but somehow recognized. I told myself her experience was alien to mine, that Christians and Muslims lived in different spiritual universes entirely. But late at night, in that space between waking and sleep, I found myself listening for something I couldn't identify. 2 weeks later, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I'd stayed late at the office, finalizing calculations for a bridge project that had consumed 3 months of my life. The building was empty except for security guards, fluorescent lights humming their electric lullabies over empty cubicles. I was tired, eyes burned from staring at screens, when I decided to pray Maghrib before heading home. I found a quiet corner, spread my prayer rug, and began the familiar movements I'd performed thousands of times. But something was different that evening. As I prostrated, forehead touching the ground, the words felt strange in my mouth. Foreign somehow, despite their familiarity. I found myself pausing between verses, not from forgetfulness, but from a sudden awareness of what I was actually saying, the weight of each phrase I'd recited automatically for decades. When I reached the part about guidance, about being led on the straight path, something shifted inside me. The air in the room felt thicker, charged with an electricity I couldn't name. I finished the prayer but remained kneeling, eyes closed, listening to the building's silence. That's when I heard it, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. A whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the space between heartbeats. It wasn't words exactly, more like a question asked in a language I felt rather than understood. My hands started trembling. Sweat that had nothing to do with the office temperature beaded on my forehead. I opened my eyes and looked around, expecting to find someone there. But the office remained empty, bathed in harsh, artificial light. The drive home that night felt different, like traveling through a world that had shifted slightly off its axis. Colors seemed more vivid, shadows deeper, the familiar streets of my neighborhood foreign somehow. I kept checking my rearview mirror, not for traffic, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something patient and persistent, and not entirely unwelcome. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine off, staring at the building I'd called home for 3 years, as if seeing it for the first time. I told myself it was stress, too many late nights, too much coffee, the pressure of upcoming deadlines. But deep down, in a place I was afraid to examine too closely, I knew something fundamental had changed. That hunger I'd carried for months had awakened fully, and it was no longer content to stay quietly buried beneath routines and obligations. It wanted something I couldn't name, demanded answers I didn't know how to find. I didn't know what was waiting for me in the coming weeks, but sitting there in my car under the streetlights, I felt like a man standing at the edge of an ocean in the dark, hearing waves approach that I couldn't yet see. Продолжаю писать остальные главы истории, следуя структурному плану и всем требованиям. The morning after that strange prayer experience, I woke with my head pounding and my mouth dry as paper. Fatigue clung to my bones like I'd been running all night, though I'd barely slept. I made coffee, checked my phone for messages, went through the motions of preparing for another day at the office, but everything felt muted, like experiencing life through thick glass. Even the call to prayer from the nearby mosque sounded distant, though the minaret was barely 2 blocks away. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Numbers blurred on my computer screen. Architectural drawings looked like hieroglyphs I'd forgotten how to read. My colleague Ahmed stopped by my desk around noon, commenting that I looked terrible, asking if I was coming down with something. I mumbled about not sleeping well, but the truth felt too strange to speak aloud. How could I explain that something had shifted in the very foundation of my understanding, that the ground beneath my feet no longer felt solid? During lunch break, instead of going to the cafeteria, I found myself walking to the nearby park. It was one of those crisp autumn days when the light falls at sharp angles, casting everything in golden relief. I sat on a bench under an old oak tree, watching children play while their mothers chatted nearby. Their laughter should have been comforting, but instead it made the emptiness in my chest more pronounced. They seemed to inhabit a world I could no longer fully access, as if I was looking at life from behind a window I couldn't open. That's when I saw her, an elderly woman sitting alone on another bench about 30 feet away, feeding pigeons from a small paper bag. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself, that drew my attention. She wasn't dressed in hijab, wore simple Western clothes, but her face had a quality of stillness I'd rarely seen. When she looked up and caught me staring, instead of turning away awkwardly, she smiled. Not the polite smile strangers exchange in public, but something warmer, more knowing. She stood up, brushed crumbs from her lap, and walked over to my bench. I expected her to say something conventional about the weather or the beautiful day, but instead she said, "You look like someone who's been asking questions." Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, and her eyes held depths that made me suddenly self-conscious. I mumbled something about having a lot on my mind, work stress, the usual deflections. She nodded like she understood more than I was saying. "I used to ask questions too," she said, settling onto the bench beside me without invitation. "Dangerous ones. The kind that make people uncomfortable at dinner parties." She laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes. My family thought I was going through a phase, that I'd grow out of it and settle back into being the good daughter they'd raised. But some questions, once they start, they don't stop asking themselves. She reached into her bag and offered me some birdseed. When I shook my head, she shrugged and scattered more for the pigeons gathering at our feet. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. I found myself studying her profile, the network of lines around her eyes, the way she watched the birds with complete attention. There was something about her presence that made the restlessness in my chest quiet slightly, as if being near her was somehow restorative. Finally, she spoke again, so quietly I had to lean closer to hear. The hardest part isn't the questions themselves. It's when you realize you can't unknow what you've started to know. Her words hit me like a physical blow. This stranger had somehow articulated exactly what I'd been feeling, the sense that I'd crossed some invisible threshold and couldn't find my way back to the comfortable certainty I'd inhabited just days before. I wanted to ask her what she meant, how she knew, but before I could form the words, she was standing up, brushing off her coat. "Take care of yourself," she said, touching my shoulder briefly. "And don't be afraid of the questions. They usually lead somewhere worth going." I watched her walk away, disappearing into the crowd of office workers returning from lunch, and realized I didn't even know her name. But her words echoed in my head for the rest of the day. During the afternoon meeting, where I nodded at appropriate intervals while my mind wandered elsewhere. During the drive home through familiar streets that still felt somehow foreign. That night, instead of watching television after dinner, I found myself standing by my apartment window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about questions and thresholds, and the strange weight of knowing things you can't unknow. The next few days passed in a haze of routine, punctuated by moments of startling clarity. I'd be reviewing blueprints and suddenly notice how the structural supports formed crosses, something I'd never paid attention to before. Walking past a church on my way to the grocery store, I'd find myself slowing down, listening to hymns drifting through the open doors. At night, my dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with bridges that led to places I couldn't see, voices calling my name from directions I couldn't locate. Friday arrived with its familiar rhythm of preparation and prayer. I woke early, performed my ablutions, dressed in my best clothes. But walking to the mosque with my father and younger brother, I felt like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. The building that had always felt like sanctuary now seemed imposing, its minaret pointing toward a sky that suddenly felt impossibly distant. During the sermon, the imam spoke about faithfulness, about the straight path, about the dangers of straying from established truths. His words should have been comforting, but instead, they made something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. After prayers, as we walked home, my father commented on how quiet I'd been lately. My brother joked that I was probably nervous about the wedding, still months away but looming larger in family conversations. I managed to laugh, to deflect their concern with comments about work pressure and late nights. But that evening, alone in my apartment, I found myself questioning everything. The prayer rug beneath my feet, the Quran on my bookshelf, the certainty that had anchored every day of my life until recently. The questions weren't intellectual curiosities anymore. They were living things, growing stronger each day, demanding answers I didn't know how to find. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and began searching, not for engineering specifications or project deadlines, but for something I couldn't even name. I found testimonies, stories, videos of people describing spiritual experiences that sounded foreign yet familiar. I watched until dawn, feeling simultaneously guilty and hungry, like someone stealing food they desperately needed. When the call to morning prayer echoed across the city, I closed my laptop and knelt on my prayer rug. But the words felt hollow in my mouth. Something was stirring inside me, something that couldn't be contained much longer. And I was beginning to understand that the comfortable life I'd built was about to change in ways I couldn't control or predict. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday that started like any other. I'd been working late again, the office empty except for cleaning crews and security guards. My latest project, a pedestrian bridge connecting 2 parts of downtown, was finally complete. The final calculations approved, the blueprints ready for construction. I should have felt satisfied, accomplished, but instead I felt hollow, as if I'd spent months building something elaborate and beautiful that led nowhere meaningful. I was packing up my desk when I found it. Wedged between 2 technical manuals was a small book I'd never seen before, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. I picked it up, expecting to find someone's forgotten engineering textbook, but instead discovered something that made my breath catch. It was a New Testament, small enough to fit in a pocket, the pages soft with age and use. Someone had left it there, probably by accident, and now it sat in my hands like a live coal. My first instinct was to put it back, to pretend I'd never seen it. But instead, I found myself opening to a random page, my eyes falling on words that seemed to glow in the harsh, fluorescent light. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The words were simple, nothing elaborate or theological, but they hit me with the force of recognition. This was what I'd been searching for without knowing it, what the hunger in my chest had been reaching toward in all those restless nights and empty prayers. I looked around the empty office, feeling like I was doing something forbidden, dangerous, but I couldn't stop reading. Page after page, the words seemed written specifically for me, addressing questions I'd barely formed, offering answers to longings I'd kept buried. When I reached the stories of Jesus healing the sick, calling fishermen from their nets, speaking to crowds about love that transcended all boundaries, something inside me began to crack open like an egg. This wasn't the distant, demanding God of my childhood. This was someone who walked among people, who touched them, who called them by name. I read until security guards began their final rounds, until I realized the sun was rising outside the office windows. My hands were trembling as I closed the book, my heart pounding like I'd been running. The questions that had tormented me for weeks suddenly had focus, direction. I wasn't just seeking answers anymore. I was seeking Him, this Jesus who seemed to speak directly to the emptiness I'd carried for so long. The drive home that morning felt like traveling through a dream. The city looked different in the early light, softer somehow, full of possibilities I'd never noticed. I parked outside my apartment building but couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I sat there with the small book in my hands, reading passages aloud to the empty car, my voice cracking on words like beloved and forgiven and peace. When I finally looked up, tears were streaming down my face, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it left me breathless. I knew then that something fundamental had shifted. The bridge I'd been building wasn't made of steel and concrete. It was the distance between who I'd always been and who I was becoming. And somewhere on the other side, patient and gentle, someone was waiting for me to finish the crossing. I didn't know what that would cost me, what I'd have to leave behind. But sitting there in my car as the city woke around me, I knew I couldn't turn back. The questions had become too insistent, the hunger too strong, the possibility of rest too beautiful to ignore. Whatever came next, I was ready to find out. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance between two worlds. I continued my daily routines, maintained my prayers, attended Friday services with my family, but every spare moment was consumed by secret reading, by videos watched with headphones, by conversations with God that felt entirely different from anything I'd known before. I'd find myself praying to Jesus in the bathroom at work, whispering His name like a secret password to a country I was learning to inhabit. The guilt was overwhelming at first. Every morning I'd wake up determined to return to my old faith, to bury these new longings and be the faithful son, the good Muslim my family expected. But by evening, I'd find myself reaching for that small testament again, hungry for words that seemed to feed something in me that had been starving for years. It felt like being in love with someone your family would never approve of, carrying a secret that grew heavier and more precious each day. My behavior began to change in ways I couldn't hide. During family dinners, I'd find myself asking questions about mercy, about love for enemies, about what it meant to truly know God. My mother would look at me strangely when I helped her with dishes without being asked, when I gave money to beggars outside the mosque, when I spoke gently to my younger brother instead of teasing him. "You're different lately," Layla told me one evening as we walked through the market. Quieter, more thoughtful. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words felt too dangerous to speak aloud. The dreams started around this time. Not every night, but often enough that I began to anticipate them, to fall asleep hoping for another visitation. They were always similar in their gentleness, their startling clarity. I'd find myself in places I'd never been, sometimes walking along a shoreline, sometimes sitting in a garden, sometimes simply standing in a room filled with light that didn't hurt my eyes. And always, there was a presence with me. Someone whose face I could never quite see clearly, but whose voice I began to recognize like music. I'd been hearing all my life without knowing it was music. In these dreams, we'd talk about everything: my fears about family, my confusion about faith, my terror of making the wrong choice. The voice never argued with me, never corrected my theology or quoted scripture. Instead, it listened with patience that felt infinite, responded with love so gentle it made me weep even in sleep. "I've been calling your name for a long time," the voice told me one night as we sat by a river that reflected stars I'd never seen. "I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." I woke up that morning with tears on my pillow and a certainty in my chest that felt like dawn breaking. The final catalyst came on a night when I couldn't sleep, pacing my apartment like a caged animal. The tension between my two lives had become unbearable. I was lying to everyone I loved, pretending to be someone I was no longer becoming, and the strain was breaking me apart from the inside. I'd been reading about baptism, about what it meant to publicly declare faith in Jesus, and the idea both terrified and thrilled me. But I knew that crossing that line would change everything, would cost me my family, my community, possibly my safety. I was standing by my window, looking out at the city lights, when I heard it clearly for the first time while awake. Not audibly, but so distinctly that I turned around expecting to find someone in the room with me. Zakariah. My name, spoken with such tenderness that my knees nearly buckled. The presence I'd felt in dreams was here, now, filling my apartment with a peace that made everything else fade into background noise. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, my voice shaking. "Jesus, is that really you?" The response wasn't words but a feeling, a knowing that penetrated every cell of my body. Love beyond anything I'd ever experienced, acceptance so complete it erased every fear I'd been carrying. I felt arms around me though nothing touched my body, heard singing though the room was silent. For the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly known and completely, utterly loved. The hunger that had driven me for months was suddenly filled to overflowing, replaced by a fullness that made me understand what the word abundance really meant. I don't know how long I stood there, crying and laughing and speaking his name over and over like a prayer, like a celebration, like coming home after being lost for 31 years. When I finally looked at the clock, hours had passed, but it felt like minutes, like lifetimes. like no time at all. Something fundamental had shifted in the very fabric of reality. I was still Zakariah, still the same man who'd woken up that morning, but I was also someone entirely new, someone who belonged to Jesus in a way that made every other belonging pale in comparison. The next morning, I woke up different. The anxiety that had tormented me for weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that felt unshakable. I knew what I had to do, what it would cost, how my life was about to change. But for the first time since this journey began, I felt no fear, only anticipation. Walking to work that day, I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years. The way sunlight fell through tree branches, the sound of children laughing in a nearby playground, the faces of strangers who suddenly seemed less strange. At my desk, I began making quiet preparations. I researched churches in nearby cities, places where I could learn more about this faith that had found me when I wasn't even looking for it. I opened a separate bank account, began setting aside money in case I needed to leave quickly. I wrote letters to my family that I hoped I'd never have to send, trying to explain a choice that would seem like betrayal to people who loved me but couldn't understand the journey I'd been on. Most importantly, I began learning to pray differently. Not the formal prayers of my childhood, with their prescribed words and movements, but conversations with someone who felt closer than my own heartbeat. I'd find myself talking to Jesus while reviewing blueprints, thanking him for small kindnesses, asking for wisdom about decisions both large and trivial. It felt natural, like speaking with a friend who'd been waiting patiently for me to pick up the phone. The hardest part was Sunday mornings, when I'd drive past churches on my way to meet family obligations, seeing people stream through doors I wasn't yet ready to enter. I wanted to join them, to sing the songs I'd been learning secretly, to hear teachings about the love that was transforming me from the inside out. But I knew that crossing that threshold would end the life I'd always known, and despite everything, I wasn't quite ready for that final step. The reckoning came sooner than I expected. It was a Friday evening, family dinner at my parents' house. Everyone gathered around the familiar table where I'd shared thousands of meals over 3 decades of life. The same oak table my grandfather had built with his own hands, its surface worn smooth by countless elbows and conversations, scratched in places where my younger cousins had carved their initials during particularly boring adult discussions. Tonight it was set with my mother's best china, the porcelain plates she only brought out for special occasions or when the extended family gathered to discuss important matters. My father sat at the head, his graying beard neatly trimmed, wearing the white thobe he reserved for Friday prayers and family dinners. To his right, my mother moved between kitchen and dining room with the fluid efficiency of a woman who'd been orchestrating family meals for over 40 years. Her hijab was the deep blue one I'd bought her for Eid 2 years ago, and she wore it with the quiet dignity that had always made me proud to call her my mother. My younger brother Khalil occupied his usual spot across from me, scrolling through his phone between bites, occasionally showing us videos or memes that made my parents shake their heads with that mixture of bewilderment and affection reserved for the digital generation. My youngest sister Amira sat beside me, her textbooks stacked on the sideboard behind us, evidence of another late night studying for her medical school exams. At 22, she'd inherited our mother's sharp intelligence and our father's stubborn determination, a combination that had carried her through undergraduate studies with honors and into one of the country's most competitive medical programs. She'd always been the family's pride, the one we pointed to when relatives asked about our children's accomplishments. The conversation flowed in familiar patterns. My father discussed his work at the import business he'd built from nothing after arriving in this country 45 years ago, speaking with quiet satisfaction about a particularly successful quarter. My mother shared neighborhood gossip, updates about cousin marriages and new babies, concerns about elderly relatives whose health was declining. Khalil complained about his supervisor at the tech company, where he worked as a software developer, earning sympathetic murmurs and practical advice about workplace politics. Everything felt normal, comfortable, wrapped in the warm rhythm of family traditions that had anchored my life since childhood. But tonight I felt like I was watching it all from behind thick glass, observing a world I could see but no longer fully inhabit. Every familiar sound, the clink of silverware against china, the soft rush of my mother's slippers across the kitchen tiles, the way my father cleared his throat before making a point, seemed to reach me from a great distance. I participated mechanically, nodding at appropriate moments, laughing when jokes were told, asking polite questions about work and school and plans for the upcoming religious holidays. But inside, the certainty of what I'd discovered in recent weeks pressed against my chest like a physical weight. The real difficulty began when the conversation turned to my wedding plans. Layla and I had been engaged since we were children, our families arranging the match when we were too young to understand what marriage meant. She was a good woman, devout and kind, with gentle eyes and a laugh that reminded me of wind chimes. We'd grown comfortable with each other over the years, settled into an easy friendship that our families assumed would naturally deepen into love after marriage. The ceremony was scheduled for spring, just 5 months away, and tonight my mother was determined to finalize details that couldn't wait any longer. I spoke with Layla's mother today about the guest list, my mother said, pulling out a notebook filled with her careful handwriting. We're expecting roughly 200 people, which means we'll need to book the larger hall at the community center. Your Aunt Yasmin knows someone who can give us a discount on the catering, but we need to confirm numbers by next week. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for the enthusiasm that should have accompanied discussions of my own wedding. My father leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the analytical expression I remembered from childhood, the look he wore when trying to solve particularly complex business problems. "You've been quiet lately, son," he said, his voice carrying both concern and subtle authority. "Your mother mentioned you seem distracted. Is there something about the wedding that's worrying you? Cold feet are normal, but we can discuss whatever's troubling you." Around the table, my family waited for my response. These people who'd shaped my understanding of love and loyalty, who'd sacrificed their own dreams to ensure their children had opportunities they'd never enjoyed, who'd taught me to pray and work hard and honor my commitments. Looking at their expectant faces, I felt my heart crack open with love and grief in equal measure. They deserved honesty, but the truth I carried would devastate them in ways I wasn't sure they could survive. "I've been praying," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched my mother's face shift from expectation to confusion. but not the way we were taught. I've been talking to Jesus. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the world holds its breath, waiting for the sound that will confirm what everyone fears they've seen. My father's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down with deliberate precision. My mother's hand went to her throat, fingers touching the small gold pendant she'd worn since her own wedding day. Khalil looked up from his phone for the first time all evening, his expression shifting from boredom to alarm. Only Amira remained motionless, watching me with those perceptive eyes that had always seen more than the rest of the family gave her credit for. "What do you mean?" my father asked, his voice carefully controlled but carrying warning underneath, the tone he'd used when I was a child and had pushed boundaries too far. I could see him trying to process my words, searching for an interpretation that wouldn't shatter everything he thought he knew about his eldest son. I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would change everything, would cost me more than I wanted to pay, but less than staying silent would cost me. "I mean, I've found him," I said simply, my voice growing stronger with each word. "And he's found me. I can't pretend anymore that this isn't real, that he isn't real. I'm sorry, but I can't keep lying about who I'm becoming." The explosion that followed was everything I'd feared, and somehow less devastating than I'd expected. My mother began crying immediately, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh sobs of someone whose world was collapsing. She spoke rapidly in Arabic, words I'd heard her use only in moments of deepest distress, prayers and pleading, mixed with accusations I pretended not to understand. My father's face darkened with an anger I'd rarely seen, the controlled fury of a man watching his life's work crumble. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "This is madness, temporary confusion. You've been working too hard, spending too much time alone. We'll find you someone to talk to, a proper imam who can help you remember who you are, what you believe." Khalil stared at me like I'd announced plans to join a circus or move to Mars. "This is insane, Zach. You can't just change religions like changing jobs. What about Layla? What about the family? What about everything we've built here?" His voice cracked on the last words, and I realized he wasn't just angry. He was terrified. Terrified of losing his older brother, of watching his family tear apart, of having to explain to friends and neighbors why his sibling had become what they'd all been taught to fear. But it was Amira's reaction that broke my heart. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers small and warm against my palm. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly, ignoring the chaos erupting around us. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Because once you say it, once you choose this path, there's no going back. They'll never forgive you. We'll lose you forever." Her words carried more weight than all the shouting and crying because she understood what the others couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. This wasn't a phase or a temporary rebellion. This was a fundamental transformation that would require me to walk away from everything familiar, everyone I'd ever loved, to follow a truth I couldn't deny even if I wanted to. "I'm sure," I told her, squeezing her hand gently. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know what this costs. I know what I'm losing. But I also know I can't live a lie anymore, can't pretend to be someone I'm not, can't deny what I've experienced. My father slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump, and my mother's sobs grow louder. Experienced what? Dreams? Hallucinations? The whispers of Satan designed to lead you away from the straight path. You think you're the first young man to be confused by Christian missionaries and their lies? It wasn't missionaries, I said, standing up to face him, feeling calmer than I had in months. It wasn't anyone trying to convert me. It was Jesus himself, calling my name, showing me love I'd never known was possible. You raised me to seek truth, Baba. You taught me to think for myself, to question everything until I found answers that satisfied my soul. I've found those answers, and they lead to Him. The room erupted again, everyone talking at once, voices raised in anger and desperation and disbelief. My mother was on her feet now, pacing between kitchen and dining room, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke to God and my father and the universe about the son she was losing. Khalil was on his phone, probably texting our cousins or uncles, spreading the crisis through our extended family network like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Through it all, my father stood rigid, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen him display. Rage gave way to grief, grief to confusion, confusion back to rage. Finally, when the shouting had exhausted itself into ragged breathing and sporadic weeping, he spoke with a finality that chilled me to the bone. "If this is your choice," he said, his voice hollow and strange, "if you've decided to abandon everything we taught you, everything we've sacrificed to give you, then you're no longer welcome in this house. You're no longer my son." He pointed toward the front door with a trembling finger. "Leave now. Don't come back until you've remembered who you are, what blood runs in your veins, what God you were born to serve." The words hit me like physical blows, but underneath the pain was something unexpected. Relief. The truth was finally spoken. The pretending was over. The impossible tension between my two lives had finally snapped. I stood up from the table where I'd learned to tie my shoes and share my dreams, looked around at the faces of people I'd loved my entire life, and walked toward a future I couldn't see but no longer feared. At the front door, I turned back one last time. My mother was collapsed in her chair, face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with grief. My father stood like a statue, his face carved from stone. Khalil wouldn't look at me, staring instead at his phone screen like it contained answers to questions he couldn't ask. Only Amira met my eyes, and in her gaze I saw love mixed with sorrow, understanding clouded by loss. "I'm sorry," I said to the room, to my family, to the life I was leaving behind. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, but I'm not sorry for what I've found. Someday, maybe you'll understand." I closed the door behind me and walked into the night, feeling the weight of what I'd just lost and gained. Inside, my family was probably praying for my soul, convinced I'd been deceived by forces they'd been taught to fear. But I knew with unshakable certainty that I'd never been more found, never been more myself, never been more beloved than I was in that moment of seeming abandonment. Standing outside the house where I'd grown up, looking up at windows glowing with warm light that no longer welcomed me, I felt Jesus' presence more strongly than ever. not in triumph or vindication, but in compassion that encompassed both my joy and my grief, both my family's pain and my own liberation. He understood what this cost, had paid similar prices himself, and in that understanding I found the strength to walk away from everything familiar toward everything true. Понял. Дописываю главу 9 «I believe» на 5-6 тысяч символов, завершая историю обращения Закария. I drove through the city one last time as the man I'd always been, past the mosque where I'd learned to pray, past the office where I'd built bridges out of steel and mathematics, past the apartment that had sheltered my old self. The familiar streets looked different now, softer somehow in the yellow glow of streetlights, as if the entire world had shifted slightly off its axis. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was walking toward something I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. The car radio played quietly in the background, some late-night talk show host discussing topics that felt as distant as conversations from another planet. I turned it off, preferring the silence that had become my companion over these past months. In that silence, I could hear my own breathing, the steady rhythm of my heart, and underneath it all, something else, a presence that had been growing stronger each day, patient and persistent, and full of love. I found myself driving toward the park where this whole journey had begun, where I'd met that mysterious woman who'd spoken about questions that don't stop asking themselves. The parking lot was empty at this hour, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I sat in my car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, looking out at the bench where everything had started to crack open inside me. Getting out of the car felt like stepping into a cathedral. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and something else I couldn't name, something that made my chest expand with each breath. I walked slowly toward the bench, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, feeling like I was approaching an altar where I'd finally lay down everything I'd been carrying. The bench was empty. Of course, the pigeons were gone, scattered to wherever pigeons go when darkness falls. But the peace that woman had somehow transmitted was still there, still available, woven into the very atmosphere of this place. I sat down in the exact spot where I'd sat months ago, when I was still trying to be the good son, the faithful Muslim, the man everyone expected me to be. How different everything looked from this same vantage point. The city's skyline stretched before me, thousands of lights twinkling like earthbound stars, each one representing lives being lived, dreams being pursued, stories being written in the darkness. Somewhere out there, my family was probably still gathered around that oak table, trying to make sense of what had happened, praying for my soul, grieving the son and brother they felt they'd lost tonight. The pain of that loss sat heavy in my chest, but it wasn't the crushing weight I'd expected. Instead, it felt clean somehow, like the ache that follows surgery when something diseased has been removed and healing can finally begin. I loved them desperately, would always love them, but I couldn't live their version of my life anymore. The man they wanted me to be had died tonight at that dinner table, and someone new had been born in his place. Sitting there in the darkness that didn't feel dark anymore, I began to speak aloud to the empty park. Not the formal prayers of my childhood, with their prescribed words and movements, but a conversation with someone who felt closer than my own heartbeat. "Jesus," I said, and his name felt like coming home, like opening a door I'd been standing in front of my entire life without knowing it was unlocked. I don't know what happens next. I don't know where I'll live, or how I'll rebuild my life, or whether I'll ever see my family again. I don't know anything except that you're real, and you love me, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore. The response wasn't audible, but it filled every cell of my body with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Love beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Acceptance so complete, it erased every fear I'd been carrying. I felt arms around me, though nothing touched my body. Heard singing, though the park was silent. The hunger that had driven me for months was suddenly filled to overflowing, replaced by a fullness that made me understand what the word peace really meant. "I believe," I whispered into the stillness, and the words echoed not just in the air around me, but in the deepest chambers of my soul. "I believe in you, in your love, in your sacrifice, in your promise that I'm not alone anymore. I don't understand all of it, probably never will, but I believe." Tears streamed down my face, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it left me breathless. All those months of questioning, of guilt, of feeling torn between two worlds, and the answer had been so simple. Not a theology to master or a doctrine to defend, but a person to know, to love, to follow wherever he might lead. The city slept around me, full of people living lives I'd thought I wanted, pursuing dreams I'd thought were mine. But sitting there in the presence of someone who knew my name before I was born, who'd been waiting for me to recognize his voice, who loved me enough to let me choose freely between the life I'd inherited and the life he was offering. I knew I'd found something better than safety, more valuable than approval, more lasting than any structure I could design. When I finally stood up from that bench, my legs stiff from sitting in one position for hours, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I'd sat there through the entire night, but it felt like minutes, like lifetimes, like no time at all. Something fundamental had shifted in the very fabric of reality. I was still Zakariah, still the same man who'd driven here hours ago, but I was also someone entirely new, someone who belonged to Jesus in a way that made every other belonging pale in comparison. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd been carrying invisible weights that had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The morning air was sweet in my lungs. The approaching sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed more vivid than any dawn I'd ever witnessed. Everything looked new, fresh, full of possibilities I'd never noticed before. I drove home through empty streets, watching the city wake up around me. Coffee shops were beginning to open, early commuters starting their daily journeys, the familiar rhythm of urban life resuming after the pause of night. I was part of it all and separate from it too, moving through a world that looked the same but felt completely different. Now that I understood who I really was, whose I really was, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sun climb higher in a sky that seemed somehow closer than it had the day before. The morning light fell across my face with a gentleness I'd never noticed, warming skin that felt new, sensitized to grace I was only beginning to understand. On my bookshelf, the small testament that had started this whole journey caught the light, its worn pages holding words that had led me home to myself, to God, to a future I couldn't see but no longer feared. I opened it and read aloud in my empty apartment, my voice strong and certain. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. New. That was exactly what I was, what I felt, what I'd become in the space between one breath and the next. The old Zakariah, the one who'd tried so hard to be what everyone expected, was gone. In his place sat someone I was still getting to know, someone who belonged to Jesus, someone who was no longer afraid of questions because he'd found the answer that satisfied every longing of his soul. Outside my window, the city continued its daily awakening, unaware that one of its residents had been completely transformed in the darkness. I didn't know what this new day would bring, what challenges lay ahead, what new forms of loneliness or joy awaited me. But I knew I wasn't facing any of it alone. In the growing light of morning, surrounded by the quiet presence of someone who'd pursued me across years of searching I hadn't even realized I was doing, I finally understood what it meant to be home. Not in a place, not with people, but in the arms of love itself, where I'd always belonged, where I'd always been welcome, where my name had always been known.